Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. If you're new to the podcast, great to have you on board. If you've been with us for a little while and you're just kind of getting into the rhythm of what we're doing here, thanks for hanging in with us. We really do appreciate it. We invite all of you, by the way, to hit the subscribe button. Your support is extremely helpful to us, and we're very grateful for all those that have jumped on side. But on the show today, I want to talk a little bit about a follow-up to a podcast we did just a couple of days ago about Pierre Poilievre. Yeah, that guy. Who made waves, which is something he's pretty good at, apparently, about the RCMP with some of his comments they did in an interview that finally made it onto YouTube, I guess, a couple of days ago, where he called the leadership of the RCMP despicable and basically accused them of not investigating all the charges or the allegations against Justin Trudeau in the time that he was Prime Minister and covering up Trudeau's inactions and what he considered to be not just ethical problems, but he suggested they were law-breaking circumstances. By the way, Pierre, as usual, offered no proof of any of these allegations. The RCMP commissioner, of course, fired back immediately. There's been a lot of pushback, as there should have been, from obviously law enforcement agencies, and also from a number of conservatives, high-ranking conservatives who have weighed in on this and said that Poilievre really crossed the line on this. We talked about those in that podcast. Corey Tenek, who is, of course, in the Harper team. He was the communications guy. Dimitri Sirtis, who was the former director of communications for the Harper government, wrote an op-ed piece that was scathing about Poilievre's actions and said that was counterproductive to the kind of unity the country needed right then. And Corey Tenek, who was doing an awful lot of the strategy for the Harper government and has since moved on to work with Doug Ford, among others, also said that it was a huge misstep and really not the sort of thing that the Conservative Party needed right now. Well, that's the background on it. So from what I've seen over the last couple of days, Poilievre is unrepentant about this. He's standing by his work. Guy wants to go down with the ship, I suppose. But others have talked about the impact that it could be having here, including Bruce Anderson. Bruce, of course, is with Spark Advocacy, and he has a podcast that talks about a number of things political. I've always been a big fan of his work, and I find it to be very informative as to trying to get a finger on the pulse of what's going on with Canadian voters. And let's face it, it can be very difficult these days because there's so many things coming at us from so many different directions. And Poilievre himself is a mystery, I think, to an awful lot of people, especially when we talked about his likability or lack of likability, more to the point, among Canadian voters. And the question a lot of us asked, and I think it bears repeating again here now, is what the heck is this guy thinking when he makes statements like this? Does he really and truly think that people are going to jump behind him and say, yeah, rally behind Poilievre? Yeah, you're right. Those RCMP guys, they're terrible. It just doesn't seem to make any sense, except if you look at it through the prism as we have over the last couple of podcasts, that this is really just Poilievre being Donald Trump's mini-me. He's tearing page after page after page from the Trump MAGA playbook about how to do things politically, how to outrage things. In other words, outrage people with some of his actions and some of his words without any validation for any of that stuff that he's saying these days. And I guess, trying to get inside his head, which it'd be a pretty scary proposition. I guess he figures it's going to be like Trump. Trump gets away with it all the time, so why can't Poilievre? Well, I don't know that it's working that well on this side of the border. He does have his supporters, though, and that's something that I think we need to be aware of. It'd be easy for us to just, dismiss this guy and write him off and say, well, he's just kind of another political clown. But there is a level of support here. But again, it goes back to what we've been saying on the podcast. That level of support is tied very much to MAGA, to the Maple MAGA, really, on this side of the border. People that like Donald Trump like Pierre Poilievre. No surprise there. The question we've got, and I guess the question that the Conservative Party should be asking these days, is that enough? Because there seems to be a schism within the Conservative Party. Now, nobody always sings from the same song sheet. There's always going to be some contrary points of view on key issues. Happens with the Liberals, happens with the NDP. You remember the NDP? Remember they used to have a party here that actually had party status in Commons? And, of course, the Conservative Party. But it's interesting that the difference here and the gap in the Conservative Party seems to be pro-Poilievre and pro-Harper. And simply because maybe, I assume, because Stephen Harper was the last legitimate leader. Well, he was the last Conservative Prime Minister, of course, until he was defeated in 2015. I know Harper endorsed Poilievre in the last election, but so what? I mean, I don't know if they dragged him kicking and screaming in front of the camera to do something like that, because I know that over the 10 years that Harper was the Prime Minister and Poilievre was in his government, I got the sense, and I covered that extensively on the radio show, I didn't think Harper had any time at all for Poilievre. Until he eventually put him in cabinet, when some of the key players that he really wanted in cabinet had done their time and moved on to other things, the Flahertys, the John Bairds, and others. Poilievre finally got a spot. And mind you, the vivid recollection I have of Poilievre with Harper is Harper having to call him in on the carpet into the Prime Minister's office and tell him basically to shut his trap. When it came to the residential school situation. Remember, Poilievre was quite outspoken about that and said he did not buy into a lot of the horror stories that we were hearing about the treatment of kids in those residential schools. And the quote that really made the headlines, that I'm sure got under Harper's skin, was Poilievre essentially said they don't need reparation for what happened there. They just need to learn the value of a good day's work. Yeah. And this is just after Harper did an announcement, of course, that there was going to be support, financial and otherwise, for the victims of the residential school system. Clearly, Poilievre was not on the same sheet as his prime minister, as his boss was in that situation. And I don't know that that's changed a whole lot since then. But it's interesting to note, as Bruce Anderson does with his polling from Spark Advocacy, that there's some vast differences within the Conservative Party. We already know that, on a much broader basis, Canadian voters just don't like the guy. We've talked about Spark Advocacy polls, Abacus polls, Nanos polls, time after time after time over the last couple of months. And the cold reality and the consistency through all of those polls is Canadians just don't like Pierre Poilievre. And, they may like the Conservative Party. They may like some of the programs, some of the policies, some of the proposals, but they just don't like the guy. One of the most telling ones was, I think it was from Abacus about 2 months ago. And we talked about this on one of the podcasts. You may want to go back into the archives and check it out. There was something like 40% of people that identified as conservative voters, 40% who identified as conservatives, said they'd be embarrassed to have Pierre Poilievre as our prime minister. And the majority of Canadians, non-conservative voters, felt the same way. Now, here's a little note, by the way, if you're a staunch conservative supporter. If the majority of people in this country think they'd be embarrassed if your guy was in charge of the country, it's not likely they're going to vote for you. Okay? You may want to tuck that away for the next election. Just a little political tip there for you, because you don't seem to have got the message before that. So I don't know what you have to see to get the read as to how Canadian voters are really feeling about this. But it's pretty clear that there is a core of support within the Conservative Party for Poilievre. Most of them are voters under 40. And most of them identify as not only supporters of Poilievre, but supporters of Donald Trump. Now the fact that those voters are drawing a very strong connection between Trump and Poilievre is something that was going to worry the majority of Canadians, because majority of Canadians don't like Donald Trump. And that may or may not, I would think, does have some sort of an impact as to how they feel about Pierre Poilievre, too. But Poilievre's brazen about it now. I mean, there used to be at least an effort, weak as it was, to try to cover some of this stuff up and, to know we're not really that way. But, now there's more Maple MAGA stuff coming out almost on a daily basis from Poilievre. And I think it's really going to hurt the party. Now, is it going to hurt Poilievre in a couple of months when they have the leadership review? Not likely. Not likely, because, first of all, this is going to be a leadership review. It's going to be in Calgary. It's going to be in the dead of winter. It gets cold out in Calgary if you've never been out there in the wintertime. So I don't even know what kind of delegations are going to show up or what numbers are going to show up. But in all likelihood, he's probably going to get 75% of the vote, and that'll be enough for him to stay on as leader. So that's not going to be an issue. Plus the fact that if you want to look at the lay of the land here for the Conservative Party, nobody's challenging Poilievre. The people that are calling for the leadership review, and of course that's going to come anyway because it's part of the party constitution, but the ones that are really pushing for this right now are people that just don't like Poilievre. But there's no pretender to the throne that's out there. Nobody who's working the ropes behind the scenes to try to get rid of him so that he or she could jump in and take the leadership role. In other words, there's no succession plan there. By process of elimination, Poilievre probably stays on simply because he's about the only alternative they've got right now, which may be to their detriment as time goes on. So you've got this break and this split within the Conservative Party, which I think was evident even in the last election. I think an awful lot of people that traditionally voted Conservative kind of held their nose and voted for Poilievre this time anyway, because, well, it's He's the only guy, and he's the conservative. However, that was back in the spring when we had the federal election. Since then, there has been a number of polls that have been done that have indicated that an awful lot of those people that voted conservative, whether they held their nose to do it or not, are now supporters of Mark Carney. They kind of like the job this guy's doing. And of course, the conservatives are saying, well, he's just stealing all their ideas. No, he's implementing Mark Carney's ideas. Mark Carney never was and never will be a Justin Trudeau kind of liberal. And most Canadians, I think, are happy about that. They didn't like Trudeau's kind of liberalism. They didn't like his kind of government. They liked Mark Carney's approach, the Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien approach, a John Manley approach, back when the Liberals were winning majority governments on a pretty consistent basis, doing a pretty damn good job running the country, too. And Canadians are comfortable with that. They're not comfortable with Poilievre. So there's the story about what's going to be happening. So now you've got this latest episode of him taking a shot at the RCMP. And by the way, Toronto Star reporting over the weekend that they, I guess, intercepted some directives that came from the party hierarchy, directing their members of parliament to kind of do the soft pedal here, the RCMP, you inflame the rhetoric like Poilievre does. They're suggesting that say nice things about the RCMP, that we're behind them. They're a key part of law and order in this country, yada, 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 yada. That's the message they want Canadian voters to see, that no, we're not anti-RCMP like our boss is. I guess some conservatives are probably wishing that directive had come out and maybe Poilievre had read it before the rest of them did. This is a guy that, to use the old analogy, that shoots first and aims later. Just doesn't really care. But Canadians care, and Canadians do respond, and Canadians do react to some of this bombast that comes out of Poilievre's mouth on a pretty consistent basis. So, and again, he's dictating to Prime Minister Carney about what he wants to see with the budget in a couple of weeks too. You better not go over this number, or we're just not going to be there. Again, seeming to think that he's going to have that sort of sway, that he's going to actually dictate or heavily influence policy. I got the sense, and I think most Canadians have got the sense, that Mark Carney is not calling Poilievre and saying, hey, what should I do? Hey, what do you think is a good idea here? He's the Prime Minister. He's going to govern. And Poilievre can respond or not respond, I guess, as time goes on. As for what's happening with Poilievre and what's happening within the Conservative Party, well, that's something they're going to have to work out themselves, okay? I know that when there can be a rift in a party, it can be crippling. There was a huge concern, of course, with the Liberals, and this is going back after Jean Chrétien left and Paul Martin did take over the party. By the way, there was blood on the floor when that transition happened. But after Martin was defeated, there was about a 10-year period, when Harper was Prime Minister, where the Liberals just couldn't seem to get their act together. Who was going to be the leader? When Martin stepped down, Stéphane Dion, bad choice. Then it was Michael Ignatieff, just as bad, if not a worse choice. And then there was the leadership convention again. And, Bob Rae was the interim leader, and there seemed to be some stability and some credibility there. And on it goes. But then Trudeau comes in here. And of course, initially, the Sunny Way stuff and everything, it seemed to something that Canadians could gravitate to. But they get tired of governance after a while, after about 10 years. We've talked about that in the past. It certainly happened to Stephen Harper. It certainly happened to Justin Trudeau. Carney comes along, and he's not just a fresh face, he's a fresh approach, and I think a more palatable choice for an awful lot of Canadians these days. And Poilievre is just trying to push that rock uphill. He's just trying to get people to hate Mark Carney, and Canadians aren't buying it. But he's relentless in this, and I don't know if the mindset here is, if we keep throwing stuff against the wall, maybe some of it's going to stick. It's a pretty poor political strategy. And I think a lot of even the conservative strategists that have been successful in the past, you take a guy like Corey Tenek, who, as I say, worked for Stephen Harper for years and has been a key figure in helping Doug Ford to not only get elected, but to stay elected and increase his majority every time. These guys kind of know what the game is like, and they know how to win. And I'm not so sure there's anybody around Poilievre, including Poilievre himself, that knows how to win. But that's their problem. The problem we as voters have, of course, is that we're stuck with these guys for the next little while. And I don't know what they're going to do vis-a-vis the policies that are going to forward with the budget and everything else. But I guess the message here, and we'll put a hand across the floor here, an olive branch to the Conservative Party, no matter what your political affiliation is. If you want to be a factor, and if you want to be a player in Canada's move forward in our economic growth to try to deal with the clown that's in the White House now and a number of other strategies that need to be developed and enhanced for this country over the next little while, before you think you can actually stand here and dictate policy, Conservatives, you got to get your own act together. Because right now, it isn't working. That's it for this edition of the podcast. As always, thanks so much for being with us. If you're on YouTube, good. Great to have you with us. Hit that notification bell and spread the word on that. And again, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, your support and your subscription is key to us, and it's very, very important for us to continue the work that we're doing. Thank you to everybody who's already jumped on board. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed. Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.